May I request Preetha and Savithri to come in. Good evening. Before we start our program, I would like to invite my colleague Prakash to hand over a small memento to both of you. It's a dancing girl of Mohanjataro.
That's nice. Yeah. Thank you.
Good evening. This is the 27th edition of our Reading Up. We started with our own publication, Journey of Civilization. Uh, for some books, we have a discussant. We had Ian Ram talking with Parkala Prabhakar. We had former Chief Economic Advisor Arvind Subramaniam speaking with Rukmani. We had Sashi Kumar speaking with Gopal Gandhi. For some books, we had external discussant, and some books I led the discussion. And today I'm very happy that Subhashri has agreed to be the discussant. Uh, Let me briefly introduce the two speakers today. First is the authors, Savithri Preetha Nair. Savithri Preetha Nair was exploring a range of disciplines in the humanities to get in her early years of scholarship. Then she moved to a present field of research, which is history and philosophy of science. She earned a doctorate in 2003 from School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, for a dissertation on museum and the shaping of the sciences in colonial India. Her interests include history of science, modernity and enlightenment, history and politics of collecting for science, sites of doing science and the sociology of knowledge, the public museum, and women in science in colonial and post-colonial India. She has three books to her credit, apart from several papers in peer-reviewed international journals and edited volumes. The two books which she had authored are the monograph on Raja Sarfoji and Chromosome Women Nomad Scientist, which we are going to discuss today. And the other book which she co-authored is on science and the changing environment in India. She is currently the Obaid Siddiqui Chair for Culture and History of Science at the National Center for Biological Sciences, Bangalore. Our discussant Subhashri is my fellow at the adjunct faculty at the Asian College of Journalism here. She was part of the science journalism team at the Hindu for nearly a decade. She has written extensively on fundamental sciences and mathematics. In 2022, she moved to IIT Madras to join the editorial team of its magazine Shastra. She received the National Award for Science Communication in Print from the Department of Science and Technology, Government of India in 2017. Thank you, Subhashri. Over to you. Take it.
It's such a wonderful uh, evening here to be with you, Preetha. We met several years ago when I interviewed you for the Hindu one, when your book was just coming out.
Yes.
Uh, Janaki Ammal is one of the most admired and studied scientists from that era. And you've so beautifully captured her life, in this uh, very comprehensive biography. And I'd like to know a lot about it. Will she be speaking here now first?
Sure.
Would you like to say a few words about the
Yeah,
biography before we start?
a few words.
Yes,
If
yes.
that's okay. Because I was given the impression that I could just speak about 15 minutes, just to sort of lay the ground Oh yeah, that's good. Yeah, and then we'll take. Yeah, take. It's not everybody can see the book. Yeah, is that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. So what I'm doing here really is am I audible? Yeah, am I audible? Okay. It's basically some lines from the introduction and the epilogue, which I thought might help for those who I'm sure most of you have not had a chance to look at the book. So it's just reading some of those lines which I think are important to know. It provides an introduction to the book. So the year was 1924, and the unabating. Slightly. Much? Is that better?
Yeah, no.
Okay, so we begin with the southwest monsoon, a very bad one. The unabating rains and gusts of blustering winds caused much destruction, also in the cantonment town of Tellicherry on the Malabar coast. So even as the great deluge drowned most parts of the town, a 27-year-old Thea woman, burning with desire to become an exceptional scientist, was preparing to set out on her maiden voyage across the oceans to America. It was as if she had walked on water, or the rivers had parted for her. For unsubdued by the floods and devastation, she surfaced miraculously in Madras 10 days later. Her boat had departed already for the shores of New York, but she would find a berth on the next steamer and reach her university in time for her course. In 1931, when she was awarded a doctorate by the University of Michigan, she was the first ever Indian woman to achieve this academic milestone in the botanical sciences. Her name was Edavalita Kakat Janaki Ammal, and her dates are 4th November 1897. She died on 7th February 1984. So, whose long and very long and tempestuous life in science is the subject of my biography. Janaki's birth into a progressive Thea family of Tellicherry coincided with the dawn of the disciplines of cytology and genetics, in which she would specialize. Using cytogenetics, agronomy, plant geography, geology, history, and anthropology, together with the sound knowledge of the cultural uses of plants, Janaki mapped the origin and evolution of cultivated plants across space and time to contribute to a grand history of human evolution. Her concerns were molded not only by contemporary ideas in cytology and genetics, especially evolutionary biology, but by the urgent need to provide an antidote to the aggressive nationalist strategies adopted by Indian agronomists in the name of food security and progress following India's independence. Janaki is without doubt a worthy subject for biographical exploration on several counts, but three reasons are central to was central to my undertaking. One is a project of recovery. Almost all the published sources on the history of women in science across the world have as their primary focus Europe and North America, with Asia, Africa, Australia, and South America ignored entirely. Wiping clean the selective clouding of history, my biography marks the beginning of a grand recovery project of Indian women in science. The subject of this biography was a pioneer and the only one among those Indian women born prior to 1900 to make a successful career of science, and yet has remained largely unknown. In the year she was awarded a doctorate, there were only one or two Indian men who had doctorates in botany, and none at all in cytogenetics, which goes to show how exceptional her achievement was, even for this reason alone. It's hoped that this This detailed reconstruction of her life and science will, at the least, enable people to know Janaki and her science better, and at best, write her back into the history of science. That she was not alone on this journey is what her story reveals. The biography offers a glimpse of the heterogeneous and unanticipated landscape that existed even in the early decades of the 20th century, one that was inhabited by women of science and men, of course, across nationalities, who tended to form a creative counterculture, constellation, or sorority of an informal or formal kind, spanning continents and sometimes even working in synergy. Each of these women were path breakers and made a success of their careers in their chosen fields of science. The biography exposes the names of a number of Indian women studying science at the university, including the Madras University, or even pursuing careers in science in the first decades of the 20th century, and sheds light on the constraints, particularly in these early years, that these women faced in accessing education, resources, and employment in science. The biography thereby also draws attention to those men of science who played important parts in altering the gender and caste ratios at university departments, even as early as the 1920s. So we have men of science from Madras, like T. Todlai Kambaram, we have M.O.P. Iyengar, and later T.S. Sadashivan of the University of Madras, for instance, who self-consciously used their scientific and official authority as directors of the University Botanical Laboratory to enlist women in scientific research and inspire them to publish their work, to which they gladly lent their names as co-authors. In this respect, there was much in common between the UBL, the University Botanical Laboratory, the University of Madras, and the X-ray crystallography laboratories of the Braggs. Some of you might have heard of the Braggs, William Bragg and his son in London and Manchester, which had more women students than men engaged in research. And also the British Marxist crystallographer, physicist. We have J.D. Bernal's laboratory in Cambridge, which is open equally to men and women. It was, however, in direct contrast to the laboratories of Nobel physicist C.V. Raman at the Indian Institute of Science and the Indian astrophysicist Meghnad Saha in Calcutta, with their preference for male students, to which some scholars have drawn attention to in the recent years. So that was one of the objectives of writing this book. It was a project of recovery. The second is that I was writing a new history of the 20th century life world. So this was the second reason that propelled this extensive biography, in that Janaki's story offered a defamiliarization of the 20th century world. It reconstructs that world from the perspective of a pioneering and highly mobile Indian woman scientist, thereby renewing our perception of the socio-political and intellectual world of the times. Janaki's working life intersected with several significant historical events: the rise of Nazi Germany in World War II, the struggle for Indian independence, the social relations of science movement, the Lysenko affair, the so-called Green Revolution, the dawn of environmentalism, and the protest movement against a proposed hydroelectric project in the Silent Valley in the 1970s and 1980s, to highlight just a few of these world events. Janaki corresponded with major personalities of the times, including political leaders like Nehru, biologists like Cyril Darlington, J.V.S. Haldane, and H.H. Bartlett, geographers like Carl Sauer, and social activists like Hilda Seligman, who all played significant roles in shaping her Weltanschauung and her science. She was a participant in landmark scientific meetings and published prolifically in peer-reviewed Indian and international journals of science, most of which were founded during her lifetime. Besides co-authoring a book with Darlington called Chromosome Atlas of Cultivated Plants, published in 1945, considered a Bible by practitioners of the discipline. She would also be involved in the nation building process, holding lofty public positions in her country of birth. The understanding that science is shaped by the context in which it is created, or that science is as social as other kinds of knowledge, informs this biological exploration. Janaki and cytogenetics, as pointed out early, were coevals, as were her fellow cytogeneticists like Barbara McClintock, Eileen McFarlane, Irene Manton, to name three of the most eminent among early women cytogeneticists. And her science is a reflection of how the discipline changed its contours with the rise of the new Soviet state and its active encouragement of applied science or state-led science, the advance of fascism and its abuse of science, and eventually World War II and the post-war reconstruction of the world. So it's actually it's a defamiliarization of the 20th century life world that this book undertakes as a project. The third reason for writing this book is, as a historian of science, I was trying to use the biographical method to write history of science. So this brings us to the third and perhaps the most important reason for the biography. It was to open a window into how science works. When scientific discoveries or scientific facts are formally presented with a notion of objectivity, histories of actions or workings, as well as the human touch behind these, are eliminated, simply lost or rendered invisible in the narrative. In other words, they got black boxed. So to know how science works demands opening up or unpacking the black box and making these messy traces visible again. Writing a scientific biography offers just such an opportunity. The biography provides an axis about which to build a contextual history of how science is done, how science is constructed. Such a history takes on board the social, cultural, and political contexts of science, which is, what we mean by the external social factors shaping science, such as funding structures, institutions, political influences, peer reviews, and bureaucracy, and the influence of caste, gender, class, and race relations on the way scientific knowledge is shaped. So we're talking of all the so-called externals. I was also interested in the places and cultures of doing science, such as the laboratory and the field, and also interested, and quite unabashedly so, in the flesh and blood of the human factors that propelled it, such as feelings, likes, dislikes, ambitions, ideas, ideologies, influences, friendships, career choices, idiosyncrasies, frustrations, and joys. Not just for the biography, the subject, but for all those integral to her social and professional worlds. In this sense, the book is not just a biography, but a compound web of biographies, taking on a reticulate form, a net-like, a complex network, through which light shines bright on the system, the swarm of actors, and the myriad ways in which scientific knowledge is constructed. One of the things that this biography aims to demonstrate is that the history of modern genetics was not all about genes or about Drosophila or the Enothera. Instead, it was a pluralistic practice involving a range of practitioners, aims, objects, techniques, styles, or mixed cultures of doing science. Scientific biographies, one is here speaking of detailed archive-based reconstructions of lives in science, including oral histories, and not, these popular accounts or short memoirs or journal articles, are a major lacuna in general, and in the Indian context in particular. Where such attempts have been made, the focus has chiefly been on the personal or the social, with a little attention, if at all, to the content of their science or on science and action. This biography, on the other hand, undertakes the daunting task of following Janaki's science, what she aimed to do, how she went about it, the strategies she adopted, what she accomplished, and what she did not, her frustrations and failures, situating all of this within a global history of plant genetics in the 20th century. Her life cannot be written from within the Nobel Prize framework of Finnish science, for hers was not about making a seminal discovery of universal relevance, as such as that of Barbara McClintock, for instance, but of producing wide-ranging and yet coherent and significant body of knowledge in the making over a lifetime of wandering, which makes the task at once both thrilling and challenging to the biographer. Worded differently, it demonstrates that there are and have been other ways of doing science than those recognized by the Nobel Prize Committee, and that these deserve equal recognition, if not more. Janaki's science, for instance, might be described as I describe it as a slow, small scale, deep, and a thick kind of science making, as against big science and everything that's associated with it. Also, at the center of most accounts on Indian scientists are national institutional builders. So, if you think of C.V. Raman or Bose or, Subramani Chandrasekhar or whoever else, except for Subramani Chandrasekhar, who was not an institution builder. Or they were scientists of the state, and they were all invariably men trained in the laboratory based sciences of usually nuclear physics and chemistry, representatives of the dominant model of doing science. On the other hand, probing the interstices, the borders, the folds, or the dimly lit narrow bylanes of this heterogeneous landscape called science shines light on those like Janaki who chose to practice their science beyond the pathways determined and regulated by the state apparatus. Her science was about, to quote Subramani Chandrasekhar, was about achieving personal perspectives while wandering, mostly in the lonely byways of science. Following one's dreams across borders implied mobility, which was not only, to me, as I see it, as a way of being, but also thinking. This biographical case study demonstrates that Janaki chose the liberating figure of the nomad as a way of being and producing scientific knowledge to break free of the tyranny of hierarchy, patriarchy, and pseudoscience. She encountered in the male bastions of state science, such as crop breeding stations. She was a border crosser in more ways than one, from her biological and social origins to her nomadic subjectivity, her solitary travels of exploration, and the nature of her scientific practice. Crossing borders and devising adventurous escapes made her life and science all the richer, and her story especially enthralling. Simply stated, this biography aims to reveal something of what it meant to live dangerously at times and make a career in the 20th century as a nomad woman scientist. I will leave it at this, though I intended to say a few things more, but we'll get those through the discussion, perhaps. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Preetha. And we'll take over from the point where you left it off. So you were talking about you've given the title of a nomad scientist to the book itself. So did she describe herself as a nomad at any point? Describe feeling that way? Yeah, sure.
She calls herself a pilgrim of science. And these are her words actually. So I'm not putting words in her mouth. And she, in her, there's sort of a huge amount of correspondence that we luckily have, which wasn't easy to sort of access except for one set of archival material at the Bodleian in Oxford. But otherwise, it was a lot of a forensic search to lay one's hands on, correspondence between Janaki and people like either her women contemporaries like Eileen McFarlane, or Frida Blanchard, and also her mentors like H.H. Bartlett. Darlington, the correspondence sits at the Oxford, the Bodleian in Oxford. So the correspondence, and she's very articulate, she's very expressive. So what you have Janaki saying, I'm a born wanderer, for instance. So this sense of being nomadic, she would articulate in various ways throughout her correspondence. And this is throughout those decades of correspondence that I luckily, sort of unearthed. So the idea of being a pilgrim of science or a wanderer or nothing can stop me. I just want to just move. I just want to grow old. I just want to just shed this burden of youth. I want to be a renunciate. I call myself an exile. Now, these are words that she uses. And what I do not stop with this ontology or the sense of her being nomadic is not just in her being, but I'm able to show that it is also in her way of making knowledge. So this nomadism gets translated not from her ontology. So there is a kind of correspondence that you see between, a very elegant correspondence that you see between the ontology, her being, and the science that she produces, the kind of knowledge that she produces. Now, how do I say this, for instance? How do I sort of uh, build that? The thing is, if you look at her choice of her problems, her biological problems or evolutionary problems that she's addressing, now these are about plants with no fixed entities. These are plants which are hybrids. These are plants whose homes are across the world. There is not one fixed home. These plants are nomadic themselves. So she's traveling as the plants have traveled, historically speaking. So, if
That's
you get
beautiful.
that, so that kind of elegance is almost like the kind of elegance you speak in mathematics sometimes, isn't it? Something that you are familiar with, the kind of equation sometimes you come up with a very elegant equation. Strangely, this elegance did not start. I mean, it didn't appear to me, or it was epiphanic after it was like an epiphany for me, but it took several years of my engaging and being with her and her work to understand and to realize that there was such a striking correspondence between her being and the kind of science that she was actually making. Yeah.
That's so beautiful, beautifully put. Um, you have spent many years with this biography, right? You told me that it's more than a decade, in fact.
Yeah, more than 2 decades when I happened to meet Janaki as in a name, and then since I was doing several other, my research projects I was doing something else, working on other books and other articles, etc. But Janaki lived with me. I mean, she lived with me. First of all, when I started my work, it wasn't like the internet that we have today, where you do a search for Janaki and you get all sorts of from factual stuff to imagined stuff that you still have floating about on the internet. It wasn't so when I started. So when I came across Janaki, it was 2001, if I remember. So I was astounded that there was, somebody, I had just come across this name, E.K. Janaki Ammal, and I just didn't understand who this woman was, because this is 1931. I see her name. As I said, I didn't want to speak about the same thing again and again, but having asked, so I started where I found her name in the Eugenics Society's journal. She was a member of the Eugenics Society, the British Eugenics Society, in 1931. And the only other Indian name that you had then was J.J. Asana, and who's another cytogeneticist, and you also had L.A. Krishna, the L.K. Krishna, yeah, Ananta Krishna, yeah, the anthropologist. So, and here is this woman's name. And at that point, when I started, I didn't know where I just thought she must be Tamil, going by Ammal, so I started from utter ignorance and I didn't know who this person was. But that curiosity is actually that led me to this book and a 20-year, sort of a kind of meditation and search and everything for Janaki. Yeah.
At what point in this journey can you say that you had this uh, understanding? Was it like a stepwise
Yeah.
understanding, or
It's invariably so, isn't it? Any kind of reconstruction of somebody's life, somebody in the sense I didn't even know where she came from, and as I said, the internet wouldn't help me at all. And I think I had my when I went to SOAS in London, that's when I had my first email address. For instance, I had an email address. I was given a SOAS AC UK kind of thing, and that's when one was starting to use the internet and not so much too. And then at that point, you weren't doing these sort of Google searches and stuff like that. Yeah. So it took me quite a while, quite a few years to actually find papers which got sort of uploaded on the internet. So I began to figure out that she collaborated with certain people. And I then went after them. There are various ways of attacking and finding out who is this person, and I think it took me until I actually went to the Baudelaire and I chanced upon the collection at the Baudelaire, which actually was the first kind of motherlode of material that I hit upon. And but that was again, it wasn't something that you had a continuous series of letters, although you have 5 decades of correspondence between Cyril Darlington and Janaki. But that was my real starting point. Because I started to read between lines, I started to sort of literally deconstruct each of these letters. And then it took me across the world. So, bit by bit, with one chunk of Baudelaire, and then I presented my first presentation on work in progress. Presentation was at the Indian Institute of Science, perhaps in 2007 or 2008 or something like that. But then that's when I started to travel, actually, started to make some progress, was much after that.
Mhm.
So it's taken me easily 16 years of focused work to produce
Wow.
this. Not that I was only working on this, but Janaki was, I was cohabiting with Janaki, she's always there and building it up slowly. And today you can actually get archival material. Say, I can write to Smithsonian and I can say, can you send me scans of this? And if I pay for it, they will send it to me.
Mhm.
But it wasn't the case when I was working on it. So I had to travel wherever Janaki was. So she spent several years in Michigan. She traveled to, she had friends at Smithsonian. She went to Jorhat. She went to Kashmir, Jammu, you name it. She was in so many places. And again, London, not just London, but she was also in places like Norwich, other places. You have Edinburgh, you have Paris, she was everywhere. She was always on the move. So the book itself, if you've had a chance to see the book, it's very geographical in a way. And it's also very cytogeographical because that's exactly what she was aiming for, trying to actually do a cytogeography of the world's flora. That was a very large project that she was sort of moving towards, but she never really accomplishes that. Yeah, so yeah, it's
Is
been
that
really
clear?
forensic.
Is her ambition to do that clear right from the letters?
Not at all, because not at all. Of course, she's not, because she is. Why I say that this is not about a seminal discovery. When I say that it doesn't, it's not if you look at all the Nobel Prize winners, it's always about some seminal discovery. something. So if you think of her contemporary like Barbara McClintock, the cytogeneticist, Barbara McClintock received her PhD in 1928 or 29. Eileen McFarlane in 1928. Janaki in 1931. And if you look at Barbara's work, and she won the Nobel decades later for her transposons. The thing is, this is not Janaki's work. Unfortunately, this is not something that a Nobel would even take a second look, because it's all about slowly, just as, in fact, Darwin, the Nobel Committee would never give Darwin a Nobel, for instance, you know? So evolutionary biology is something like that. All field sciences are like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you would know. And it's not like your physics and, you're not laboratory based. When you are based on the field, the kind of work, the kind of discoveries you make are small scale, and they're always cumulative. You always build up. So it's like a large planetary jigsaw puzzle of the evolution of the world's flora, for instance. And you're sort of working out each part of this puzzle. And it's not just one person who can do it. So many people together have to work out, have to resolve so many of these problems, little problems, make small discoveries. Say discoveries of, say, the origin and cultivation of the sugar cane, which Janaki began. So cytogeography is not an aim that she ever had when she started. She started very humbly. So she is basically taking on one particular, the saccharum. So she's taking the sugar cane and saying, let me first resolve the origin and the evolution of the sugar cane. So the world's sugar canes, where have they originated from? Where have they traveled from one place to the other? So she first resolves that and starts slowly building up with other flowering plants. She didn't work with non-flowering plants. She worked with flowering plants. She worked with economic plants. She worked with medicinal plants, with ornamentals, also with aromatics in Paris. Yeah. So no, she didn't. She didn't think of cytogeography until much later.
Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned when we were talking an hour back
Yeah.
that it's quite difficult to come up with the names of other women who were working at that time. You mentioned current science and all that. Can you talk about that a little bit? How you came up with
Sure.
names?
Yeah, you're right. I remember that. Yeah. So, as I said, that this is not, as you start reading, you start meeting more Indian women of science. I mean, and not something that none of these names are really known, you know? And it was a huge amount of shovel work, a lot of soiling my hands, like, combing, very painstakingly combing through, for instance, the University of Madras calendars from the 1880s till about the 1960s, 50s actually, because after that they stop listing the names. There's so many numbers, you see, so they can't start listing. They stop listing the names, and then it doesn't become useful anymore. And I've had to do this for Calcutta. University of Calcutta. I've had to do this for the University of Bombay. I had to do this for Benares. Again, within Bombay, you have the Royal Institute of Science. So to comb through the calendars of all of this takes a long, long time. And it's only because I was able to do this that I can for certain say that she indeed was the first one to achieve this academic milestone of the first Indian woman to have taken a PhD and a doctorate in botanical science. And the first person who actually takes a PhD in any scientific discipline is M.M. Mehta, Miss M.M. Mehta. So Mervanji Mehta. And so I introduced Manekji Mervanji Mehta in this book, for instance. So you actually meet a great number of women, but none of these, including M.M. Mehta, who takes a PhD from the Imperial College of Science in the late 1920s in chemistry. And then she's got a PhD and a DSc from the University of Birmingham in fermentation. She comes back and lives a most, invisible life as a lecturer at Queen Mary's. And Queen Mary's, talking about Madras, and we are speaking right here in Chennai today, and the kind of the role that the women's colleges, the first ever women's college, in fact, in India, is the Queen Mary's College, started in 1915 or so. So Janaki was among the first batch of students to study at the Queen Mary's.
I see.
So she comes from Queen Mary's has actually produced somebody like Janaki, and she also starts the other institution which played a very important role in taking science to Indian women, and they came from across the country, some of them. In fact, M.M. Mehta, she's from Bombay, but she chooses to work and spend the rest of her life at Queen Mary's, teaching Queen Mary's. And then she never does any research after that. And who knows about M.M. Mehta? So these two colleges, I'm trying to I bring those today. They are highlighted in this book. The role that the WCC, the Women's Christian College, which was actually run by a host of missions coming together and setting up this college, played a very big role in taking science to Indian women.
Even today, I think the bulk of Indian women research force is in the universities, and
Yes, true. So that's an important point. The thing is, I do not discuss. It's already so big. It was about 800 odd. I could just go on. So even now, it is sort of beyond people to actually. I don't know how many people I've met who actually read it. It's painstaking. I don't know. You've done it. I don't know if you unless you're really so interested in genetics, you might not even, you might just skip through a lot. I haven't still got a decent review for it. So I've lost track actually, but you were talking about the Queen Mary's and the WCC.
yeah, and you said you would mention current science.
Yes, true. So how did I actually pick up, on what basis did I say that these were women, Indian women in science? And it's not just by because the number of students who do their undergraduate degrees really disappear afterwards. Yeah. So the only names, how do those names, I culled out these names from the earliest Indian journals of science published. The first one is Current Science, published in 1932, published by the Current Science Association of Bangalore. And the other is the Indian Academy of Sciences, which was established at the same time. And they start their series A and B and all that for biology and mathematics and, physics and chemistry. So if you look at the names if you want to look at Indian names before 1932 is very difficult, and there are hardly any. So the names that you have are that of Janaki, for instance. She would publish in the Nature, or she would publish in Cytology, which is a Japan-based journal exclusively devoted to cytology. So these are the journals that they could publish. But with the Current Science, it became much easier for Indian women to actually find a place to send a scientific note, for instance. So that's where the names of these men that I just mentioned, the Madras universities, Todlai Kambaram, the botanist, or M.O.P. Iyengar, Patsarthi Iyengar, and you also have people like Sadashivan. So they were very encouraging of these postgraduate or the MSc or MA students of science, women students. And the University Botanical Laboratory played a very important role in actually getting them to do research. So whatever bit of research that they would have done was always translated into a scientific note communicated by these mentors, these male mentors. So you have some of the early women to actually published in the Current Science come from the UBL. the University Botanical Laboratory. Again, this is not an institution that people know of at all. And it is simply a university institution.
Excuse
And
me.
it's done so well in those early years. And the kind of role that it played is not something small. And it needs to be highlighted, actually. So Madras has had some of these institutions which have really been, played very important roles in getting women in to do science.
Okay.
Whether they actually took it on and went on, throughout their life is a separate story. Because if you look at the employment opportunities of women in science at that time, the employment opportunities were restricted to becoming university teachers or becoming school teachers. Or if you were exceptionally good, you might get into a breeding station. But even a breeding station, you have only 2 or 3 names that I know of who've actually found jobs in the imperial breeding stations. One is in the citrus breeding station, Janaki in the sugarcane breeding station, and so on. So, because of the social, you have people like Muthulakshmi Reddy and the Women's Indian Association, and we have people like this, isn't it? The social reform movement was pretty strong.
Mhm.
So you have people like Margaret Cousins, and you have, as I said, Muthulakshmi Reddy and all the rest of them. So the other option that girl students had was to do medicine, because the track was that you get into social reform somehow. How do you do it? Either you become a doctor or you become a teacher. The research was not something that was on the agenda at all. So there were very few people like Janaki who it was very important to keep research going and not get into a staid teaching position just for money. She made that very clear. Money doesn't mean a thing to me. I need time and just about enough money to do my research. And she carried on like this till the end of her life. She would borrow funds from her students, when the UGC grant was sort of drying out to keep the research going.
Wow.
So you're talking about a person like this ending up in the 1980s, early 1980s, reclusive, no money, and having to keep her research going. And she was also becoming more forgetful. It was a very bad last few years for Janaki.
You spoke about her time at the sugarcane breeding station, right?
Yeah.
And in the biography, you have talked about the patriarchy she encountered there
Yeah.
and the support, paradoxically, which also came from men of some standing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, like I said, the just as she returns from Michigan after her receiving a doctorate, she knew that she had to come back and she find a job. Who would employ her? I mean, there was no option for a cytogeneticist at that point. So the breeding stations, the imperial breeding stations, were all for breeders. And breeders don't need a doctorate, but you need a lot of field experience. So that is something like you have your T.S. Venkatraman, who's a master breeder of sugarcane. So he was the person in charge of the imperial breeding station and who was trained under someone like Charles Barber. Now, when Janaki arrives, Venkatraman does see some benefit, some purpose in having somebody in having employing somebody who's an academic cytogeneticist, only so far as it would reduce a bit of the trial and error that
Hmm.
he was always having to engage on the field. You see, because the sugarcane it's a plant, it takes a certain time to mature. And then
Right.
only then will you know if it's been a success. If you've actually produced a super cane, for instance, which had high sugar content, or it was an early growing one, early maturing one, was it resistant to diseases, etc., could only be done with a lot of trial and error, even for a master breeder like Venkatraman. So he felt that if it was somebody who actually could examine these chromosomes, could might be able to tell him if the cross that he's trying out could end in an a sterile one or a fertile one. Because if it ends up in a sterile one, in most cases it does, it's a lot of waste of time, right? And so you have the state breathing down your neck, breathing down Venkatraman's neck to produce one of those super canes to revolutionize the sugar industry in India, because all your sugar imports were coming from Southeast Asia, from Java. So there is an option there, and Janaki is being suggested as an option for a cytologist at the breeding station. That takes a long time to materialize for the government to take a call on it. So meanwhile, she's jobless. So she goes, that's how the Travancore government, to its credit, so they played very a big role in actually encouraging women to come and teach at their institutions. And Janaki was the first woman to be appointed professor in an entirely men's college in Travancore. So that way she'd actually made it was like, the glass ceiling was broken. But she wasn't so excited by all that. The newspaper announced the appointment, and there was a great, celebration about it in the media, etc. But she was hardly happy, because this was just out of desperation that she takes it up, because she knew that would be the end of her research. And already she was allowed by Todlai Kambaram to spend a little time at the University Botanical Laboratory. He said, you can set up a cytology laboratory. So she actually brings some saccharum sugarcane samples from the imperial breeding and starts her work. But the appointment is delayed endlessly, and she's having to take up this Travancore teaching job. She's totally unhappy, except that it brings her some money. But then she meets several women there. And there's this, I said, this kind of subculture that she suddenly discovers there. You have Uke Louise, the Dutch economist, she comes from Cambridge. She studied at Cambridge. She was jobless. You're talking about in the early 1930s, no jobs. And she again comes to the Travancore government. The Travancore government invites her. So she meets Ukak. She meets several other Queen Mary's women who've been appointed at the Women's College in Trivandrum. So they form this kind of a group, and they have a great time in Trivandrum. And to imagine Trivandrum, which is such a conservative staid place in the early 30s, with Janaki driving a car around, and you have her British American friend, geneticist Eileen McFarlane, coming there. You have Cyril Darlington being invited to the Trivandrum, what was today the Maharaja's College, to inaugurate the botanical whatever club, nature club. You're talking of a very different Trivandrum. And that's when she meets Gandhi, So it's a very exciting life in every way, But there's a lot of sadness because she's unable to take her research forward. So then ultimately she is at the breeding station. There again, Venkatraman, the breeder, and here you have the cytogeneticist. There's a huge kind of tension that builds up. So Venkatraman thinks that this kind of academic cytogenetics that Janaki is spending a lot of time on, like the origin of the sugarcane, etc., belongs to the university and not to a breeding station. So he feels that she's taking on things which are really not useful to the breeding station, for instance. So there is a lot of persecution. She's not allowed really to publish some of her academic research because it's all about applied science. So she accuses Venkatraman, for instance, of being a pseudoscientific and being sort of perpetuating pseudoscience in the station, because in her mind, this is not a scientific way of doing crosses, etc. But he would say, I know better because I've been doing this on the field for decades. And this, to see value in actually studying chromosomes had not yet arrived at the imperial breeding stations. So she was, far ahead of her times. There wasn't any institution which could employ her. Yeah.
Darlington was a thesis advisor, right?
No,
No.
Darlington is the cytogeneticist based with John Innes, with whom, after she finishes a PhD under B.M. Davis at the University of Michigan, she travels to, in 1931, she travels to England when she's just missed the roundtable conference about that time. And Darlington is a maverick. Darlington is a brilliant nonconformist. He's a complete, and Janaki is smitten by him, and she's in awe of his brilliance, and they strike a wonderful relationship, which also is emotional. And she spends about 3 or 4 months with Darlington and then comes back home. Yeah, but it's a relationship that lasts till his death. He dies about 2 years before she did. Yeah.
She even takes care of his children.
Yes, during the wartime. Yes, with all the wartime rationing. Darlington was going through a very bad time with his wife, and it was a very unhappy kind of relationship. She was a depressive, and the children had to be taken care of, 3 of them. And there was so much food rationing, and Janaki was very inventive with cooking. So she could cook up some of those dishes with just some potatoes and, whatever little ration, carrots and stuff like that. So she was a great help. She took care of the baby. She played nanny to these children, It was a very different time, the wartime. So, yeah.
Yeah, you have devoted a whole section to doing science in the time of
Yes,
war.
because that's exactly when the Chromosome Atlas was published. So 1945. As I said, that was the only benign kind of happening that came out during this time, when otherwise it was about bombs and a very sleepless nights and the blitz and so many of these things. And she comes out. She tends to really excel, during such trying times, especially with these bombs. She writes, I can hear bombs. There's a bomb that's just fallen to the garden. But she says, I love it. She loves a bit of drama, and she's got this death wish. So I say it's like doing the science of life in the face of death is something that always propelled her. There was this death wish which drove her, actually, which made her seem very adventurous. So she would say, as she was passing through the Chambal, as she was driving between Benares and um, Lucknow, and then she says, she's traveling with her nephew. She's driving, and then she says, I really wish some of the Chambal dacoits, one of them just comes and captures us. It'll be such fun. And she was someone like that. Yeah, loved a bit of adventure.
Okay.
Yeah,
She lived in many places, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
She was nomadic, literally,
yeah,
and
correct.
she's lived in the UK, US, Europe, and India, and many
Yeah.
places. So, which of these places did she find most conducive
Yeah,
to
I
the
think
work?
the one place that she always wanted to go back is Michigan.
Michigan.
Michigan. She always imagined, even in her 70s, she would write to Eileen McFarlane or to Frida Blanchard and say, how I wish, I could just sort of suddenly just appear there in the Botanic Garden, the University Botanic Garden. I just want to relive those. She relived those moments, and her letters are full of that. She longed for Michigan. It's not England. She longed for Michigan. Yeah.
But there are many chapters on Madras, right? She's had many
I
phases
think
in
two or
which,
three chapters. Yeah.
yeah.
So,
So
so, so,
did she
so
have a,
yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that I mean, it's good that you um, get me to say a few things about Madras. So the Madras one, if I remember the chapter, Madras one is all about her early years studying
Queen
as
Mary?
Queen Mary's and then teaching at WCC, I suppose. And then she goes off to Michigan and spends a year or so, then returns again. And then she carries on teaching, and then I think she goes back to, yeah, she goes back immediately. Just after about a few months, she goes back to complete her doctorate. So when she comes back. I think the Madras 2 chapter is when she comes back and she sets up a small cytology laboratory in the Madras University, and then briefly goes to Travancore, returns, and then she's at Coimbatore. I think it must be Madras Coimbatore or something like that. And then you have the 1970s. So it's like completing a full circle. So 1970s, she's finished it all. She's, she was born 1897. So 1970s will be what? She's in her 70s, right? So she was an emeritus scientist at the University of Kashmir. And then she comes back, and then now she writes to Darlington, I don't know what to do with myself. I have become this old. I still want to do a lot of research, but I don't know where to go. I don't have a place to go to. It's a very sad letter. She writes to C.V. Raman, and he's been very kind with her. He wants to give her a place. I haven't got that in my book. This is something I've discovered later after the book. But Raman, again, he's not in any position to, because he started his Raman Research Institute, and he's almost, finishing off his life, actually. So he's not able to keep her there. So you are Gopal Iyengar, the biologist who is at the molecular division of the BARC. So she knows Gopal Iyengar. Gopal Iyengar is younger to her, and she's met Gopal Iyengar in England. And he invites her to come and do a bit of research on the gamma beds, induced mutations in some of the saccharum plants which had refused to flower. The saccharum Z plant that she had created, a unique cross that she had created. So she takes that up. So a few months she's spending at the Baba Atomic Research Center in Trombay, and I think I have a picture there, her sitting with Darlington's new book, sitting on the beach in Trombay, and you've seen her, she's all frail already. And then she realizes that she can't stay there for more than a few months. That's when you have Raman, it looks like C.V. Raman gets T.S. Sadashivan, who is the then director of the Center for Advanced Studies in Botany, invites her to spend time here and to live in Mother Oil. She wants to live in Mother Oil, which she calls it her hermitage, and she just wants to be there, do her experiments, and occasionally come in. And she takes on students for doctoral research. So the last few years, she's on a UGC grant. She's also on an INSA grant working on ethnobotany. So by then she'd moved to ethnobotanical research, and the Mother Oil has an ethnobotanical garden named after her, actually. She lives there in a little room with a huge number of cats which she constantly observed, them crossing and figuring out, and studying just by observation, not really using a microscope or, any chromosomal study, but just morphological. And she ended her life here. Nobody in Madras knew that here was this amazing pioneering Indian woman scientist living in Mother Oil in a little room, reclusive. She dies in 1984, and the Hindu publishes some 4 or 5 lines. That's it. It's like forgotten.
I was going to ask you, do you understand this phenomenon of how such a phenomenal scientist could have lived here, and yet the public
Completely
don't know?
oblivious. Nobody knew about her. Nobody knew. Not even the Center for Advanced Studies in Botany, Sadashivan knew who she was, right? But that's all. That's all there was to her life.
Was it because she was reclusive, or
Not really.
not really? Right? She
I
was
think that-
celebrated also. She had the Padma Awards, and
Oh, yeah, but how late was that? How late? You- She's finished her life. And then you give her a Padma Shri when you have so many other women social work, or having been Birbal Sahni's wife, all of them get their awards so much earlier. So you have, like I've said, the only consolation that Janaki would have had is Mary Punnan Lucas, who is the first Surgeon General of India. She's the first earliest doctor that you have, and who studied in Edinburgh and London. Mary Punnan Lucas, in her 90s, was given a Padma Shri, just a year before Janaki. So if you analyze all the Padma Shri winners amongst women, it's quite amazing. It's a very telling story.
Mm.
And to have all these men, from Sadashivan, Swaminathan, who is Janaki's so much junior to Janaki, M.S. Swaminathan, all of them had got their Padma Bhushan and all those, things decorated way back in the 1950s.
Yeah.
So that tells you what it is. And if there were women who've got it, they were either social workers, sports, or a doctor, and I think a dancer, or somebody in the arts. So if it's women, it's always social work and the arts and stuff like that.
Mm.
And you had just Asima, who was given it in the 1970s, if I remember right, Asima Chatterjee, because she was the first Indian woman who took a PhD in science from an Indian university. She was 20 years younger to Janaki,
Okay.
and her PhD was taken in the 1940s. She's the first Indian woman scientist to be given a Padma Shri.
Yeah, it's quite a grim scene,
Yeah.
as you put
Yeah.
it. Um,
And she was no institution builder. That's an important aspect. All these men, whether Baba, so many of the others, all of them had institutions in their names. They built institutions, so the government got them to build institutions. So somebody who is an exact contemporary of her, B.P. Pal, Benjamin Pyare Pal at the IARI,
mhm.
who researched on the wheat. The minute that with the Indian independence, all of them actually become scientific bureaucrats. There's no research anymore. You get one of those safari suits, and then they're always sort of managing us, a whole lot of people directed science, state directed science, producing these high yielding varieties. And then it culminates, of course, with Swaminathan and the Green Revolution and all that. And she says, with the Indian independence, with August 15, 1947, it marks a death knell to research in India.
Mm.
And she returns. Because when she arrives at the IARI, people are all doing other things. They're all sort of food security, and issues are all very different. So that's why she speaks of lysenkoism, which is abounding, which is spreading throughout India, and she's very concerned about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you also tell about how she became a champion of the environmental movement, which wasn't even called that at that point?
Absolutely. The thing is, with
And
Janaki,
you also mentioned that the ozone hole was discovered during her time, right?
the genetic resources. The thing is, it's only with the 1960s genetic resources becomes a category to reckon with. It was invented then as a category. But with Janaki, way back in the 1930s, while she was in the sugarcane breeding station, she actually articulates this grave concern of genetic erosion that she notices in the breeding station. So, as crosses were being made, say by Venkatraman and his team, if the hybrid was sterile, that was immediately thrown away from the program.
Mm-hmm.
And she knew that was like getting towards a kind of monoculture, a kind of restricting the kind of sugarcane that would be produced. And if they were sterile, to the breeders or to the state, they were of no use. And she knew by throwing these off, and including so much of these wild genetic resource that was being simply wasted and eroded away, she writes in her letters being deeply concerned about that. And it's only much later, and so precocious she was, and it's only much later that the idea of conserving genetic resources becomes a kind of movement from the 1960s. You get it? So she is already concerned about this, and she's already expressing some of this concern on monoculture. She's expressing concern about monoculture very early, but in particular in 1955 at the Wenner-Gren Symposium, which was the landmark symposium at Princeton. And she was the only woman participant of the symposium. Even Rachel Carson was, though shortlisted, Aldous Huxley, so many of them shortlisted, but they did not make it to the final list. So this is something that she was very deeply concerned even before such categories began to gain circulation and visibility.
Okay.
Yeah.
One last question before we open out to the audience. The other people have attempted biographies of Janaki Ammal, but yours is more comprehensive, and it's essentially different in a way, right? Can you talk about
I mean, you can't ask me, you should say that.
it is so. Can you talk about the difference?
One is, I don't even want to comment on basically somebody else's biography on Janaki Ammal. One is that my approach, the kind of archival sources, I've used some 30 plus archival sources from across the world. Mine is an analytical one. I know what mine is about, and I'd rather stick to that. And I'm a historian of science, so it matters to me to confront squarely the science that she was doing, and not simply about her mixed race origin or talking about anything that is merely social. But I would like to see how that social penetrates the kind of science that was done. So that's also telling you it's an approach that, as a historian of science, I take of understanding science by deconstructing how science is done, how science is practiced. So that's what I'm trying to do here. So it's a very constructivist approach to writing a biography. And I have, it's archive based and analytical. And as I said, it's not as just a biography of a person, it's a compound biography. It's also a biography of modern genetics. It's also a history of a new history of the 20th century world as seen through the eyes of nomadic Indian woman biologist.
It is a book that spans, it's from 1800s to the 20th century, right?
Yeah.
And all that happened in between, the world wars, Indian independence.
Huge number, very eventful. Her life has intersected with several of these world events, including movements within science, like the social relations of science, the Science and Freedom Society, like Michael Polanyi and people like that. There was a lot. J.D. Bernal's Social Function of Science, books like that. She was a major contributor to the modern evolutionary synthesis, which marries Darwin with Mendel, So she's had a very big role in shaping the modern evolutionary synthesis. Not just people like Julian Huxley and Stebbins and Ledyard Stebbins and the other American, scientists, or someone like Irene Manton, who was elected fellow of the Royal Society, while Janaki was not. You see, and it's not just in India, therefore.
Sure.
England, where she actually produced so much work, did not recognize her with a fellowship of the Royal Society, despite having played a far bigger role than even Irene Manton.
That's tragic. Yeah. So,
in fact, the first colored or Indian women to be elected to the Royal Society happened as recently as, when Ramakrishnan was the president of the Royal Society, his sister gets appointed, and then you have the other, the Wello-based uh, a woman medical scientist who just slips on. Gagandeep. Yeah.
Gagandeep.
Still, yeah.
Oh, yeah, right.
So, yeah.
Even the Indian Academy of Sciences
Yeah, she was a founding member of the Indian Academy of Science. She was the only woman. She was the founding member.
had very few. They still have only about 15% of women fellows.
It took so long for women to appear in the current science, for instance. You had British women and American women publishing. But Indian women, other than Janaki, you didn't have in the early years of the current science and then in the Indian sciences.
Yeah. I hope the situation will change soon. And
It's changing. Yeah.
I think we already have a person waiting to ask a question. 4 questions. Okay. Thank you, Preetha, for the lovely discussion we had.
Thanks thanks to you for
Good evening.
going through this.
Good evening, madam. Wonderful discussion and lovely
You can-
talk. I'm Nikita Mehra. I'm a physician scientist, and I'm a proud member of the organization that I presently serve in, Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy Amma, the Cancer Institute WIA, which is the Women's Indian Association, Adyar. My question is, as different from the West, barring exceptions, we often see that clinical doctors and scientists work in silos. We don't see them working as often as we would want to see. Did Amal madam, did she collaborate with several? So was she work? For example, was she Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy Amma's? Did they know each other? Were there?
Well, I have no evidence that they knew each other. It's well possible that they would have known of each other, even met each other, because she was at Queen Mary's. But I do know of another friend of Janaki's who knew Muthulakshmi Reddy pretty well. She's C.K. Kausalya, who taught at the Queen Mary's. But I have no evidence that they corresponded or they knew each other. Yeah. As an historian, I need to make sure that I have something to show the evidence, and I don't.
In general, do scientists, back in the day, were they working together with medical doctors as well within our country?
They did. If I'm working on somebody called Eleanor Mason. Now, Eleanor Mason was a physiologist. She trained at Johns Hopkins. She studied at Mount Holyoke and then Johns Hopkins, where physiology was actually just shaped then. And there was a kind of, it was attracting a lot of women, not just men. Women took to physiology. So she comes and she introduces physiology. I shouldn't be sort of giving all this away right now because it's something I'm working on. But she introduces physiology in the Madras University syllabus. And what was until then simply called home science or home economics is given a much more of a scientific status with Mason and her team of students at the WCC. Physiology was offered as a subject of study, and a lot of women took to physiology. So there was no more of this kind of gendered discipline like home economics. It was so much more of gravitas with physiology, and they offered physiology, and that's when she starts research in nutrition, and these women's bodies, these girls' bodies became her subject matter. So she worked in metabolism, and these women provided their bodies for her metabolic studies, which included Janaki.
Thank you so much.
And sorry, your question. So we do have Eleanor Mason interacting with the medical department because of this reason. She was working on metabolism. She was the earliest to publish in the current science. Isn't it amazing? So, male physicians who were also researchers, medical researchers, because they were researching public health, there was interaction between Mason and them. But it's not something that is so, because there were so few women anyway, few women who were doing research anyway. And they happen to be, Mason happens to be an American researcher teaching at the WCC.
Thank you, madam. Can I ask you or can I make one last?
Sure, absolutely. Go ahead.
So the face of the organization is the third leader. The second leader was Amma's son, Dr. S. Krishnamurthy.
Yeah.
And as you know, Padma Vibhushan, Dr. V. Shanta, she passed away in Jan 2021.
Yeah.
You must know very, very well. She comes from C.V. Raman Society.
Yeah, I know.
Dr.
Yeah.
S. Chandrasekhar's family. So, of course, she was, and everyone told her to lead the organization. Dr. S. Krishnamurthy, Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy. She was made the face of the organization. So it's very heartening that in a male-dominated world, there were many male scientists. I have nothing for or against. I'm just making the statement out of whatever I've read. There were several who did not want women members involved. And here is a family member who is leading this organization and has taken it to.
Maybe you should write her biography. She deserves one, doesn't she?
Mentor number 1 is sitting right here, Paneer Selvan, sir. So
together, maybe.
Not without him. I won't write that book without him.
As long as you write one. Yeah.
I'm here for more inspiration. I will.
Read the biography. Get it and read it. There's a new, the second edition is South Asian edition, which is priced.
I think that's there.
Yeah, there's another question there.
So I'm Varuni. I work at the Institute of Mathematical Sciences. So I'm just sort of interested. So
this might be a slightly mentioned.
Sorry? Yes.
Who she mentioned to? There was somebody.
Oh, there are
multiple. Very active that was.
So no, so I'm sort of interested in a little bit more technical kind of stuff. So
I am listening to you.
Sure. So so you mentioned Barbara McClintock, who was working in a very similar field, right? Like she was also a cytologist working with plant breeding, with maize and things like that. Was there a lot of collaboration, correspondence between them? Because they were also both women before their time, was there some camaraderie?
Yeah, it's a very a logical question, I would think, because they were exact contemporaries. McClintock was slightly younger than her, but Janaki finished her PhD a little later than McClintock. There was nothing at all between Janaki and McClintock. I don't know if it disappoints you, but the thing is, their approach to genetics couldn't be any different. It couldn't be more different than Janaki and McClintock are wonderful contrasts. They're different cultures. They represent different cultures of doing science. So you have people like Barbara McClintock, or you have people like B.M. Davis or Bartlett or people like this, or Edgar Anderson, all of them contemporaries. They were all people who worked with model organisms. So McClintock would all her life work on maize, as you would know. Some of them would all their life work on, for instance, Drosophila, or the Enothera, or the Tradescantia. All their life. If you contrast that with someone like Janaki, Janaki never really worked on one particular plant or family. She worked across flowering plants. And her approach was looking at both micros, looking at chromosomes of particular species, but also looking at macros, looking at plants as they traveled, as they migrated in the steps of man. Yeah? That was the trail that she was looking at. So she She was not somebody who wanted to actually look at the inner mechanics of a cell, for instance, and come up with something fundamental. She was rather using the laboratory to purely examine the cell, study the chromosomes for anything extraordinary happening, trying to see, understand sterility. She was interested in breeding. So she was interested in experimental breeding and in the improvement of plants because she happens to work in institutions like the Royal Horticultural Society, so which produced these unique cultivars, which were important for them, or she was producing these interesting economic crosses at, say, a breeding station like Coimbatore. So her interest was not really getting deeper and deeper into the workings of, say, something called the gene. She wasn't even looking at the gene. She was purely looking at chromosomes to understand what was happening on the field. So her interest was in taxonomy, in cytosystematics. Well, for McClintock, it was of no consequence. You get it? So their questions were very different. And they never really needed to interact. In fact, they almost crossed each other at certain institutions. So Will McClintock spent some time at Cold Spring Harbor. You have Janaki who's actually applying for a grant there and, almost missed each other kind of thing. Of course, she doesn't take it up. There were just a handful, as you rightly say, but she was more in interaction and collaboration with another British American, amazing woman who is simply absent in any American history of women in science, Eileen McFarlane, whose biography I'm writing. So you have various ways of doing science, various cultures of science.
Last question, anyone? Yeah, Bharati.
Thanks for the wonderful discussion. I'm Bharti from the Institute of Mathematical Sciences again. I'm a science writer there.
Thank you.
And even today, it's very unusual to see many women, especially working in the fields of, say, ecology and biogeography, which I'm trained in. And it's absolutely amazing to hear that Janaki Ammal was interested in biogeography to some extent, right? Movement of living organisms through space.
To a great
and-
extent, yeah.
Yeah. And I was just curious at that time,
Yeah.
what was her inspiration when she was growing up? What drew her to study what she did later on in life? Is it particular teachers perhaps as she was growing up? I mean, when she went to college, or what was some of her early inspiration?
Yeah, well, your guess is perhaps I can only guess, and that's what I'm trying to do, just making some logical guesses because nowhere she says, this has inspired me. But we know that see, she came from a particular kind of social background. Her family was very special. She had a very erudite father who is greatly interested in nature, in plants in particular. Their homestead was full of very interesting plants. He was also very interested in birds. They went on walks, they went on these plant hunting excursions. Her elder brother was a forester. She used to make drawings for him, botanical drawings for him when he was in the Forest Service at Dehradun. When he was being trained there. And it was a family affair. The whole thing was like a familial industry. Everybody was somehow or the other desiccating plant specimens for maybe the elder brother, or Janaki is making drawings, or she's doing something very. She's very knowledgeable about plants even as early as her school days. So you have this example that one of the family members shared with me, where a school inspector comes to, at school, the convent school that she was studying, asked her to identify a particular plant that he had placed on the table. And she was the only one who knew what it was, and she immediately said it was a Gloriosa superba. She gave him the botanical name for it. So you might think of that as showing some kind of an affinity, proclivity, or some kind of an interest in plants and some knowledge about plants. But this comes from the great library that her father had. So it's not just about plants, but her father had a library of all sorts of books. So she was just 10 when he passed away, but they inherited this wonderful library, and they were always out and about in nature. So every weekend was like, just going to the seaside, going to, talking about these things. And it was something that she grew up with. And I would think that it's the Forrester brother. In fact, she toyed with the idea, with people like the Women's Indian Association and all that. So she toyed with the idea, why don't I become a doctor and then work for the Servants of India Association, Ranades Association? Why don't I sort of get involved with the freedom of the fight, the struggle for freedom? She was beginning to feel guilty of not being directly involved in any way, because there was so much of all this reform, conversations and talk that was going on at Queen Mary's. Lectures were being, Gandhi was here, and she was going and listening to all this. But then deep inside, she felt she had to become a scientist. She says, not a doctor. I have to become a scientist. She writes in some way something close to that in a letter to an elder brother. And she decided that she was going to pursue a degree in science. That she was clear. And she gave up this idea of being a doctor. Her roommate, who she was, part of the first batch of the Queen Mary's, her roommate, who, she was very close to, she becomes a doctor, one of the earliest doctors. And Muthulakshmi Reddy, of course, is not the first doctor. You have several other doctors. But then you think that because they've got Anglo-Indian names, they're not Indian. So what do you do with those names? They're neither British. And you got several of them. But Muthulakshmi Reddy is the only name that you know.
Anandibai Joshi.
Yeah, that's the other name that people know. I'm talking of all those people who studied at the Madras University Medical College.
Sure.
Whose names we don't know because they've got English sounding names. And that's the only criterion.
There's this book by, I'm forgetting the name of the author, First Ladies or Lady Doctor, which actually documents all the things that women had to do to become doctors in those days. It's a nice book.
Yeah, I'm pretty familiar with these kinds of books, and I think they need to take a completely new look at these things. Yeah.
So, any questions from the online media? Not really? Okay, anything else anyone wants to say?
Oh, you have to be very charitable to the family. They have saved so much. And to also expect them to save some drawings by Janaki done in the 8th and 9th standard, too much to ask in India. To have so much is all credit to that family. My earliest photographs is about 1902. Where can you find that today? In which family? In which house? Especially with the kind of climate we have. Letters. I have the earliest letters written in 1912.
Wow.
Can we think of another family which would keep a 1912 letter written by this young student from school to her elder brother? So I will not ask for more.
So, if that's all, we'll thank the speaker, thank the author today, and big hand to your effort.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Thanks.
This was lovely. Nice talking to you.
You made it easy for me.